Watching News at Prime, let's get into this conversation now. There's growing unhappiness over the proposed changes to the Private Security Industry Regulation Act. Now, it could see a limitation on weapons used by security companies, which critics believe will negatively affect their work. The South African Gun Owners Association chairperson is Damian, who joins us from Cape Town this evening. Mr. Enslin, good evening to you and thank you for your time. I'd like to start this conversation with you. What's your perspective on the need for the amendments in the private security industry space? Are they necessary?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks to viewers. No, they're absolutely not necessary. If one reads through the document, it's poorly drafted, unworkable, and there's a lot of duplication between these proposed regulations and the Firearms Control Act. The SAPS and the Firearms Control Act is the actual regulatory authority or body for firearms, and you will see in these regulations there's a lot of duplication, a lot of restrictions that you mentioned. So South African Gun Owners Association, we're dead set against it. This proposed regulations would be the death knell of the security industry, and many of our corporate members are private security businesses, and they will be severely restricted by these proposed regulations.
There is a need, though, some will say, for the tightening of firearms controls, while at the same time allowing for those who are legitimate in this space to continue working so that their operations thrive. Do you not believe that there is a need for that balance?
Well, you can't, by creating more regulations and more laws doesn't mean you're going to tackle the actual problem. As I said before, the SAPS has the Firearms Control Act and various regulations. They should have the ability. Unfortunately, as we know, they're under-resourced and they don't have enough resources and the ability to tackle organized crime, because unfortunately organized crime obviously has infiltrated not just the police but all aspects of life, including in some certain circumstances the industry itself. But let's utilize what we have already. The criminals, by the nature of being criminals, are never going to abide by more rules and regulations. Only the law-abiding companies will abide by these new regulations if they had to be passed. And we're certainly dead set against these regulations being passed. But there is an act of law already, which is the Firearms Control Act with various regulations, Regulation 21, Regulation 22 of the Firearms Control Act, that has the ability to deal with these type of situations if you want to combat sort of organized crime being involved in the industry. So again, let's resource the police adequately. Let's resource proper special task force units that can tackle the issue at hand.
Do you believe that these proposed amendments pose a risk to the viability of the industry as a whole? And what about public safety as well?
Absolutely. I mean, this affects a large portion of our community. So not just the 580,000 security officers that work with the industry, but you and I and all South Africans across the broad spectrum of South Africa rely more these days on private security than, unfortunately, the police because they're so under-resourced. So this is going to have a severe impact on all of us. So restricting the types of firearms that security companies can use, as well as, crazy enough, restricting the use of non-lethal weapons, pepper sprays and tasers, which you would think would be the alternative to using your firearm in a self-defense situation, is just craziness in itself. It's just totally hamstringing the entire industry, as well as restricting the entire industry. For instance, if a security officer had to use his firearm in self-defense and the company's under investigation because of legitimate use of self-defense, the entire company cannot operate any further because it has to now stop issuing firearms. That is one of the proposed regulations here.
Do you believe then that there are alternative approaches to this without the added regulatory burden? And if so, why hasn't that been used, especially to root out the rogue elements?
Unfortunately, it's about resourcing, also about going after soft targets. The government always appears to want to go after soft targets. So again, it tries to create regulations that only, or laws that only the law-abiding security companies will abide by. The criminal element will never do that. So we need to enable our special units. There are special units within the South African Police Force, such as the firearms units, but they are under-resourced. There's not enough personnel there. There's not enough detectives investigating. There's not enough crime intelligence anymore to actually tackle organized crime. So it's no point creating more laws and regulations. It's not going to help. The only persons that are going to be abiding by it is you and me and the law-abiding citizens.
Do you think that there are long-term effects that these amendments might have both on the industry and the overall security picture in the country?
Absolutely. If these regulations come to being, our security companies will dwindle as a result. The operational effectiveness will be hamstrung. So they won't be able to protect you and me and the ordinary South Africans out there that relies on private security. They just won't be able to operate anymore. There's restrictions on the usage of firearms, or when they can use firearms, or where they can use firearms. And there seems to be some sort of rationale behind it, which we can't fathom why you would want to restrict the main crime sort of combating forces that we use at the moment, unfortunately, which is the private security industry. It would decimate the industry completely, resulting in the criminal element running much more rogue than it is at the moment.
Let me thank you very much for your time. Damian Enslin, he is the chairperson of the Gun Owners Association of South Africa. Well, listening in to that conversation is the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority CEO, Manabela Chauke, who joins us in studio tonight. Mr. Chauke, good evening to you and thank you very much. So you've heard the South African Gun Owners Association. They clear that these regulations or amendments are not necessary. From your end, why are these regulations necessary?
Good evening, Xoli, and thank you very much for hosting me. I think, first of all, let's rather correct the narrative that is out there by saying that no one will lose their job in the private security industry through this regulation. That is a very incorrect narrative. Secondly, that there is no company that will be closing due to this regulation. And thirdly, let's correct also, stay away from the anxiety that is being created on society to say that people will lose their jobs because of these regulations. From where we begin, these regulations don't start from now. They were first published in 2003. Nothing happened. 22 years later, we sit with a very worse situation than we had in between the years in terms of the rogueness that has happened. Remember that we live in a constitutional country. The rule of law is the first thing. So for any authority to act, there must be law first. So if we were to regulate this part of what we're trying to regulate now, we needed the law to do that. The only instrument that is there is the Firearms Control Act. The regulations in the Firearms Control Act are so basic and general and are not designed specifically for the private security industry. So what we're trying to correct here is that gap, to deal with the rogues, to deal with those that are within the private security industry. And there's three things I think my colleague that is being confused about.
Yeah.
We're trying to regulate possession, use, and issuing. We don't license firearms. That's the role of SAPS. We don't issue or revoke licenses. That's not our domain. Our domain is to control the possession, the use, and the issuing. And all those three elements are specifically for security service providers. And what we mean a security company and a security service, a security officer. So they are both classed in what a security service provider is defined as. So those are the basic things that we have to get first correct before we continue with the debate.
And I think that clarity is quite important, particularly on the issue of job security. So let's then move away from the misunderstandings that you've just clarified and talk about what you mentioned earlier during the conversations where you were on other platforms. You are saying that these measures are conditional rather than absolute.
Yes.
So let's talk about under what specific conditions would the use of a machine gun be permitted?
First, let's clarify some of the terms that are used here. There are some people who are saying we are prohibiting. Now, that is an incorrect use of words, because there is no word in the regulations that seems to be prohibiting anything. There are people who are saying we are disarming. There is no such word to say that security officers are being disarmed. So what do we mean by conditional use? We're saying that you may use this. You may not use the following type of firearms. Basically what we're saying is we're categorizing scenarios or instances where you may use these firearms. I'll give you an example. If you work in a crèche, for instance, you don't need a rifle, right? But if you come to us and say, in this crèche, we have children whose parents belong to a particular income class, they have a high risk, and they can be kidnapped. Yeah. And therefore, we need to use this rifle because we of the view that people who would come here would use the similar weapons. Yeah. Would allow you. Why not? All we're saying is motivate, first thing first, conduct a risk analysis. So before you use the firearm, that's all we say. I think that's very basic to every security service.
Let's use another living example, and it will, I think, remain fresh on South Africans' minds. July 2021, Phoenix, Durban. It is alleged that a private security company was responsible for most of the deaths that were seen in Phoenix. What guns were used there, based on your recollection, and were those people allowed in the first place to act in that manner?
Well, I think the allegation was that most of them had rifles. They used big, firearms and so on. Again, is the very same thing that we're trying to deal with here. Why were they in possession of those firearms? Currently, we openly license them to possess those firearms without a specific risk analysis as a requirement. So remember, the licensing is done by SAPS through the South African, Firearms Control Act. And there's certain criteria that is used. We're not far off from that criteria, by the way, but we're saying for you to possess, use, and issue to a security officer, you need to conduct a risk assessment.
Let's then talk about how these regulations will help distinguish, and I'm using that word decidedly, distinguish between a legitimate security operator and those that are there to simply exploit the loopholes.
I think that's where the major benefit of these regulations come. So you've often heard of people who walk into a cemetery, for instance, over the weekend where people are being buried, and there's this one individual who's also coming to, to pay his last respect to whoever, and he's got 16 bodyguards. And all of a sudden, people have to move, and all of that. And then later you see people shooting up in the sky. So that's where we distinguish between the rogues and the people. So these regulations are designed to ensure that we do not have those type of scenarios. I hope that example brings it home.
Will these regulations have an impact? And I think you've already answered this, but there are those who will still be worried anyway that with the tightening of controls, people are going to lose jobs. Why are you so assured that there are not going to be job losses?
Because we don't plan to disarm anyone. We don't plan to restrict any lawful use of these firearms. All we're saying is that we need to know where are you going to use it and for what purpose are you going to use it. Is that purpose, is there a need for it for that purpose, and have you done your risk assessment to justify the use? The one aspect that is widely bemoaned is the issue of ammunition. Yeah. We're saying in the regulations that you should have no more than reasonable quantity. And we just open-ended. If you go to the Firearms Control Act, there is a definite number that sets there as not more than 200 bullets. And from there, per individual, per firearm. And then you'll have to go and motivate why do you have more. We understand that you should actually have more at some instances if you were to wage war with criminals. But,
you know,
once again, risk assessment should tell us that.
You mentioned right at the beginning, and I think it's a perfect way to end the conversation. You mentioned that the situation has gotten progressively worse. Right now, we sit with a situation that is simply out of control. Why is that? What happened?
If you ask me to account for the movement of a firearm in the private security industry, I will not be able to tell you. Why is that? Because we don't have a mechanism to police that. In this country, for me to tell a security company that you need to tell me who you gave this firearm to, at what time, where did they use it, for what purpose, we need the law. And that's what we're trying to do.
And that's why the picture looks so bleak right now.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time. And perhaps as a final, the window for public opinions on this, I think it is somewhere in April. Do you have an exact date for when it is that people can still submit their opinions on this?
What has been published is the 25th of April, as if I recall very well. That date is not a final date. There's still a long process. Assuming that we finalize all the representations that we have, they still have to be considered, put before the minister. We've already lobbied him and asked him to consider an extension, and that is later to be decided after he's considered this matter. So definitely there might be an extension, and from where we're sitting, the minister is amenable for that. But that is his decision at the end of the day. But yeah, we're still far off from finishing.
Mr. Manabela Chauke, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
The Chief Executive Officer of the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority. And lo and behold, as we are talking about the proliferation of guns, or guns that can't be accounted for, there is breaking news that's just come in. 4 suspected criminals have been killed in KZN, and this was, we understand, a shootout between these people that are dead and the police.